If you look around on roads in the United States, chances are you might find quite a few European cars, mostly from German luxury brands. But when you look around on European roads, you'd be hard-pressed to find a modern-day American car. Interesting, considering it wasn't always like this. How did this happen? Welcome everyone to episode 65 of the Automotive History series, where I'm going to take you on a tour through the past decades and look at the role of the American car in continental Europe, and also explain why I don't see a lot of American cars here anymore. Since I'm from the Netherlands, it's mostly from a Dutch angle. Camera joke. But I think it's a similar story in many other European countries as well. Welcome everyone to how the American car failed in Europe. After doing quite a few episodes on the history of a car industry of various countries, I started to notice a pattern. American car companies aggressively expanded, and by the 1920s and 30s, companies like Ford and General Motors were active in almost all far corners of the world, including Europe. Especially countries like the Netherlands, which didn't have a national car industry to begin with and was always internationally oriented, welcomed foreign car makers to sell cars there. Ford was already active in the 1930s and quite popular with cars like the Model A, although it should be noted that car ownership at this point was still fairly low. Cars were very much a luxury for many Europeans at the time, but if you owned a car, chances were that it was an American car, valued for its solid build quality, powerful engine and great level of comfort. And mind you, cars like a Ford Model A weren't even all that big and fuel-thirsty, as is now commonly associated with American cars. The image of American cars in the US in general further improved after the Second World War. See, not only the Americans were seen as the liberators of Europe, right after the war, the Marshall Plan was enacted, where the US sent all kinds of goods and services free of charge to Europe to help rebuild the war-torn nations. So you better not say anything bad about these people, as they helped to win the war and helped to rebuild the country afterwards. And with this help also came the American culture and way of life to Europe in the 1950s. People looked up to the USA, which just experienced its post-war economic boom, where everything was big and impressive. Houses were big, cities were impressive, fridges were large and fully stocked, and cars looked cool. People watched American movies in theaters, wanted to chase the latest fashion trends from the USA, and listened to American rock and roll music on the radio. But what about the cars? To say that American cars swarmed European roads is a bit of an exaggeration, but looking at pictures from the 50s and the 60s, you certainly see quite a few Detroit cars driving around. But as always, owning a car in Europe was expensive, so owning an American car that dramatically changed in size, engine displacement and fuel consumption during these years was quite the next step. Most people that drove American cars had such jobs like doctors, lawyers, managers, but also for very practical reasons like ambulances and taxis. Looking at some of the brochures at the time, well-equipped Chevrolets and Fords were often priced right up there with the more expensive BMWs, Jaguars and Mercedes. But that wouldn't stop American car makers from trying to sell them here, because both Ford and General Motors had other tricks up their sleeves. Ford also had a separate line of European models, mostly from Germany and the UK, and GM owned Opel. And when you look at pictures from car shows from the 1960s, almost all models made by these giants were on display. So when you had a bit of money, you could buy a Ford. And when you really had some money, a Ford, but from the United States. By the 1960s, most European countries experienced their own post-war economic boom, some 10 years after rebuilding the country. Wages increased and the average European could finally afford such luxuries like the Americans already had. It became an unofficial contest in the neighborhood who was the first to own a TV, a refrigerator, or a car. But, as always, money is tight, and automobile ownership a costly endeavor, so Europeans usually chose for typical people's cars instead of full-size land yachts. Case in point, my grandfather's first car was a Fiat 600, and not a Chevrolet Impala. But, as luck would have it, around this time the American car makers just released their own compact cars in a reaction to the growing popularity of compact cars in the US. Cars like the Chevrolet Corvair, the Ford Falcon, and the Chrysler Valiant proved to be popular around the world. Although they were intended as cheap and budget-friendly cars in the US, they were often regarded as well-appointed compact luxury cars in many other parts of the world. The Falcon became a legendary model in Australia and South America, and the same can be said about Chrysler Valiant and Dart cars. In Spain, the Darts were converted by a local company and seen as full-on luxury cars. Budget cars or not, in the USA, in the European eye, you still get a fairly large car, not huge as some land yacht, that came standard with a 6 or 8 cylinder engine, and automatic transmission, which pretty much sums up European luxury cars at the time, like a Jaguar or a Mercedes. And so, especially the mid-size and smaller American cars proved to be somewhat popular in Europe through the 60s. Those that really made it had the full-size American cars, and even some royal families drove American cars, including the Dutch royal family, who used to own American Fords. But then, by the 1970s, much of the world, including Europe, was hit by the effects of the oil crisis of 1973. In the meantime, especially the full-size American cars grew to gigantic proportions, with huge engines and a fuel consumption that would rival my dad's alcohol addiction. Not exactly the perfect fit for Europe with its small roads, parking spaces, high fuel prices and taxation. And it was. British TV program Thames Television from the 1970s did 2 segments on why American cars were bought in Britain. Although a clear answer was not given, they mostly talked about why American cars won't fit in the UK.
How do the American importers manage to sell any at all when they appear so unsuitable for use on our roads?
Some drivers said that they appreciated the loads of standard equipment and luxuries from many American cars came with. You absolutely had a good deal on a car if you were willing to pay for it.
They're tremendous value for money. The optional equipment that you can get for your money is outstanding, and only American cars can offer this sort of value for this sort of equipment.
But with the fuel crisis also came new mid-size, compact and downsized models. And as much as these cars were sold in the US with the message that they were American with European size and handling and were a great alternative to cars like a Mercedes, which they weren't, they were also sold in Europe with the exact same message, with then the other way around, which actually worked. Cars like the Chevrolet Malibu and the Ford Granada were the perfect blend between European size, weight, and fuel consumption, and typical American comfort and luxuries for those that wanted it. A great alternative for a regular Mercedes. And during these years, the exchange rates were also favorable, making some American cars more accessible than ever. But here is where the role of the American car also started its great decline. The Malaise era, the time when overall quality and engineering of American cars were at an all-time low, also affected their status in Europe. Also, the taste in automobiles changed, and the gap between American and European cars became wider. A great example are the various European models from the 1980s with futuristic and aerodynamic design, whereas some American cars were still stuck in the 70s with vinyl tops and waterfall grills, the whole Brougham package. And these are fashion trends that most Europeans didn't like or didn't understood what the appeal was. And I'm not saying that the following 2 examples contribute to the decline of the image of the American car in the Netherlands specifically, but during the 1980s and 90s, American cars were increasingly seen as gaudy cars for gaudy people. In the 70s and 80s, you had a comedy duo performing various sketches on TV. They were self-proclaimed free guys, small entrepreneurs with shady business practices, if you know what I mean. And what did they drive? Exclusively American cars.
Zelf heb ik eigenlijk uitsluitend 25 jaar lang Amerikanen gereden. Chrysler, Oldsmobile, Studebaker, NES. Nou, je kan ze niet kwijt, dus benzine, ze worden zo gejat. Nee. Dus nu ben ik aan het kijken naar een Europeaantje.
And then there was a fictional TV series where a dysfunctional white trash family was placed in a luxurious and upscale neighborhood, and you can imagine what shenanigans would follow. And what do they drive? A pink Chevrolet convertible. I think you start to get the idea. Some people started to associate these land yachts with people like Liberace and Elvis, and not the 50s Elvis, but the 70s Elvis. Loud, dramatic, gaudy, overdressed, and huge. Sales declined during the 1980s and 1990s, and so the American car business in Europe was caught in a vicious circle. It never really played a huge role to begin with, and it had its ups and downs, but with less and less cars being sold, think of tens or a couple hundred cars a year, the need to maintain a dealer network and parts service also became less and less interesting. And so even less cars were getting sold. Brands like Buick and Mercury were recognized less and less, and well, you get the idea. By the 2000s, those who bought American cars were typically older retired folks trying to remember the good old days when their dad bought an American car. So really just a niche enthusiast market. And then there was a difference between European and American automotive regulations, which required additional efforts and costs to convert American models to comply with European regulations. By the mid-2000s, some American car makers like Chrysler and GM tried to bring some of its American brands and cars back into the picture, but it was a lost cause. Most Europeans had already forgotten about them, and in what way would an American car stand out anyway compared to what they could buy at home? Chrysler discontinued their efforts after the disastrous partnership with Daimler and Mercedes, and GM closed up shop after 2008 crisis, and the only one left is Ford. But they have been selling models specifically made by and for the European market since the 1930s, so how American are they over here anyway? So to give a clear and concise answer, it's just not the size of the car alone, it's the complete package. You can't really buy an American car anymore, and if you do, you get a car that is generally big, very costly to buy, very costly to own, with almost no supporting dealer network, and a very low resale value because of the lack of brand awareness. But you know what? Let me show you what I mean. In this second part of the video, I'm gonna do some calculations. Let's say I want a modern-day American car. I want a big, fat Cadillac Escalade, a huge SUV. This car is not officially sold over here, so not officially sold in the Netherlands, but there are some small companies that are specialized in importing them, so you can buy them here, but what if I want to import it myself? On the website of Cadillac, I see that if I want to buy a mid-range Escalade, the suggested retail price is about $100,000, which is roughly 93,000 euros. And I'll continue in euros from here, but I'll include the dollars. So, I bought a car in the USA. Now it's time to bring it to Europe. Let's say it cost about 2,000 euros to get it shipped to the Netherlands. When it arrives in the port of Rotterdam, it's time to pay the import duties. These are 10% of the retail price plus shipping cost, so that's an additional 9,500 euros. Now it's time to pay the taxman. The VAT, or value-added tax, is 21% and calculated of the total cost at this point, so that's another whopping 22,000 euros. But we're not done yet. Oh no. Welcome to the Netherlands, because over here we have another tax known as BPM. Initially, this was a luxury tax from the 1960s, when owning a car was still seen as a luxury. But these days it is some sort of emission tax, and the more polluting the car is, the more you're going to pay. Luckily, the Escalade with its whopping 6.2-liter V8 is no tree hugger, and the calculations are a bit complex, but trust me when I say that I need to pay an additional whopping 65,000 euros of emission tax. Last but not least, let's be generous and add another 5,000 bucks worth of fees, registrations, licenses, and modifications to the car to meet European regulations. And ta-da! This is what an Escalade would actually cost in Europe. Almost 200,000 euros. All the extra cost more than doubled its original retail price. I literally pay a Cadillac Escalade worth of taxes. To put it into perspective, you know what else I can get directly here in Europe for 200 grand? Audi SQ8, Range Rover P550e, BMW XM, or a Porsche Cayenne. But we're not done yet, because after taking out a second mortgage to get the car, now it's time to calculate the monthly running cost of an Escalade. First up is the vehicle tax. Over here it is based on the weight of the car. In some other countries it is based on fuel consumption or engine displacement or vehicle size, but here it is the car's weight. The idea is that if the car is heavy, it must have loads of luxury equipment to carry around, and thus it's a luxury car, and thus you should pay accordingly. Luckily, the Escalade is no athlete, coming in at almost 6,000 pounds or 2,500 kilograms, and I'd pay €191 per month in road taxes. Then there is insurance. Based on my age and no previous accidents recorded, I like to have the so-called all-risk insurance that pretty much covers everything, so every damage. This costs another €277 a month. Then there is fuel. This one is a bit tough as there are so many variables, like how much are you going to use the car and how far you're going to drive every day, etc. You get it. Based on the given fuel consumption of the Escalade, it's only slightly worse than my current car, so I can safely say I have to fill it up every week. With the fuel price hovering around €2 a litre or $8 a gallon, yeah, that's right, $8. Think about that next time you cry at the gas station in the US thinking life is unfair. That means that I pay another $560 worth of fuel per month. And then there is maintenance. I guess an average of $100 a month is fair. It's a completely new vehicle, but parts are somewhat rare and expensive over here since it's a luxury car after all. The total adds up to a staggering $1,100 a month I'd pay for owning a brand spanking new Escalade, but this comes with 4 disclaimers. Number 1, I haven't even considered depreciation. I think it's very hard to give an estimate, but considering it is a rare car nobody really wants over here, good luck selling it after you're done with it, and I think the depreciation will actually be catastrophic. As you can see, no car payments. The system of auto loans and car payments so common in the USA is very uncommon in the Netherlands. Most of us are raised with the idea that you can only pay for something when you saved up for it. These calculations are based on a heavy luxury SUV. Imagine that you are even more royally screwed if you buy a big and fairly inexpensive SUV, like a Chevrolet Suburban or Ford Expedition. You pay roughly the same, but you get less in return. The average monthly salary in the Netherlands is around $3,000. This means that you'd spend a third of your salary on an Escalade or something similar, if you really want to buy such a car. I hope this really puts a couple things in perspective, and this is just an Escalade. I also ran the numbers for the Ford Mustang, and that gets even more ridiculous. Instead of importing it through a specialized company, Ford officially sells the Mustang over here. So let's say I want the GT version with a V8 engine and 6-speed manual. The suggested retail price in the US? $43,000 or €40,000. Suggested retail price in the Netherlands? A money-sucking €132,000. That's $142,000. This effectively more than tripled the price. So when I buy a Mustang, I effectively buy 3, 1 for me and 2 for the government. I think you start to get the picture here. There's nothing wrong with American cars per se, but they're completely priced out of the market, and there isn't really anything they can do about it. That's just how our local taxes work. In case of the Mustang, which is a sports car but one for the masses with a fairly basic interior and affordable price, it directly competes with the high-end sports cars over here, price-wise. Because you know what I also can get for $142,000? An Audi A8 with roughly the same power, a Porsche 718 Cayman, or a Lotus Emira. So who buys modern-day American cars over here? Roughly 3 types of people. The first ones are what I like to call the regulars. These buy cars such as the Tesla Model 3 and the Ford Mach-E, and I hope you can see where this is going. These are all electric cars. And much like many other countries, the Netherlands also has special regulations for the promotion of EVs, including tax advantages and deductions. Plus, don't get me wrong, but I don't consider Mustang Mach-E's as true American cars, if you know what I mean. Then there are also Dodge pickup trucks. Wait, what? Yeah, much like the US, the full-size pickup has also found its way over here. But how? These things are huge, heavy, thirsty vehicles. They would suck the money right out of your pockets, right? As I've just explained with my Escalade example. Well, not if it's a company car. If you buy it as a company car strictly for commercial use and limited personal use, you don't pay any BPM, so no emission or registration tax. You pay half the usual road tax, and you can even address some of the maintenance costs as business expenses. And so in recent years, American car shows have been flooded with all the same basic, boring, dark gray Dodge lease pickup trucks. And their owners like to thump their chests, priding themselves that they absolutely love the American way of life, which is nothing more than a very narrow vision consisting of cowboy boots, barbecuing, owning guns and shooting them at minority groups and getting away with it. No, you don't like American cars, you just like tax advantages. The second group is what I like to call the enthusiasts. Those that are pretty much people like me that really love American cars and really go the extra mile to get something obscure and unique and are willing to pay the full price for it. People that bought and owned V8 Ford Mustangs, Chevrolet Corvettes, Dodge Challengers and Cadillac V-Series performance cars. But of course there remains somewhat of a rare sight. Not long ago I saw a Lincoln MKX, and it just makes you wonder who the hell buys a Lincoln crossover over here where you have so many alternatives. The last group is simply the commercial market, like emergency services. Back in the 1980s, the Rotterdam Police Department used Chevrolet Suburbans as police cars. And as you may know, the average European car in the 80s wasn't exactly large, so these beasts had quite the commanding presence on the road. Up until the late 2000s, Chevrolet Express vans were used as ambulances, and as of the present day, some funeral homes use Cadillacs and Lincolns as hearses, while there are also plenty of European alternatives. The only time I see a fairly recent Cadillac, 9 out of 10 times it's a hearse. And this concludes a little peek into the European perception of American cars. As you can see, many Europeans buy a car with their wallet and not their heart. It's a matter of money, and modern American cars are at a huge price disadvantage in some countries. Completely priced out of the market and therefore simply not competitive and a first choice. So you have to be a special kind of enthusiast, or really just crazy, if you want a car that comes from the United States. Remember that the next time you ask me to get a Challenger with a V8.